Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last Saturday night, Christopher David, a veteran of the United States Navy, was walking in Portland when he came upon an odd sight. Federal agents in full tactical gear, heavily armed, looking for all the world like the operators that we drop into terrorist havens in Afghanistan, patrolling the streets of an American city, detaining Americans, hustling them unexplained into rented minivans. Now, is Mr. David a masked ninja of anarchy? No. Was he throwing rocks or carrying bottles of gasoline? No. Mr. David was curious, and he stood there, clearly unarmed, clearly not a threat, curious. And here's where it gets interesting. And any American who hasn't seen the video needs to look at it right now. A federal agent, gas mask, body armor, camouflage, bristling with weapons and tactical gear, approaches Mr. David, winds up, and beats Mr. David repeatedly with his truncheon. Mr. David doesn't move. His hand has been broken by a federal agent, but he doesn't move, not a muscle. Well, the agent is confused by this, and he hesitates. But backup arrives. Another federal agent sprays Mr. Davis repeatedly in the face with pepper spray. Now, this is heartening to the first agent, so he winds up and hits Mr. David again with his bat. Now, I don't care how cynical you have become about our country. I don't care whether you've signed over your time, your talent, your treasure, your integrity to the support of Donald J. Trump. If you have a drop of American blood in your veins, your soul dies a little as you watched a heavily armed federal agent beat a United States Navy veteran. So what are combat-ready federal agents doing in the streets of a city which does not want them there in a state which did not ask for them? Are there bodies piling up in the streets of Portland? Are there 150,000 dead, just to choose a number, Americans in Portland? No, there's not a single fatality. Of course not. Like so many cities, Portland boiled over in rage at the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. And yeah, regrettably and illegally, a minority of protesters have committed acts of vandalism. Bottles and rocks have been thrown, windows broken, threats made. That's not okay, ever. But protecting property in Portland or anywhere else is the job of the local police department, the state police, and in a worst-case scenario, the National Guard. Why? First, while federal agents are legally entitled to protect federal property, they are not authorized to patrol municipal streets to enforce state and local law. That's an idea that goes back to our dissatisfaction with King George, and it's an idea that my Republican friends used to care about. Second, operationally, agents of the Border Patrol and the Marshal Service are not trained to manage protests. They are trained to patrol borders and to chase fugitives. A heavily armed individual with no identification or insignia, trundling people without explanation into an unmarked van is likely to be misunderstood in a way that could lead to violence, particularly in a heavily armed society. Finally, there's the question of the president's intentions, which are pretty clear. We've seen how the president responds to real crisis. Almost 150,000 Americans dead of COVID-19. Denial, misinformation. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the COVID-19 deaths on the planet. That's a disgrace. It's a lethal disgrace. George Floyd, an unarmed black American, dies at the hands of the police like so many before him. That's a lethal crisis. The president asks about black Americans dying at the hands of the police, and he says, so are white people. So are white people. What a terrible question to ask. And now the president threatens to send heavily armed federal agents to New York, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore. Do we have a problem? No, we do not. Take it from an unclassified Office of Intelligence and Analysis report by the Department of Homeland Security, and I quote, "The regularity of violence amid lawful protests in Portland since 26 May contrasts with national trends, which reflect a steady decline in violence during the last 2 weeks." A steady decline in violence over the last 2 weeks. Mr. Speaker, this is important because democracies die. But they don't die fast. They die because people come to believe that the media is the enemy of the people. They die because the president's supporters are more given over to that president than they are to the rule of law, and they die because citizens become used to the sight of federal agents acting not to protect them, but to attack them. We have been warned. And the question is now, what do we do? I yield back the balance of my time.